I mean, you can take WMDs and the Gulf of Tonkin, and you could see the manipulation of information to bring the American public into accepting and approving of a war that really had no basis. So I started writing about that. It wasn't long thereafter I noticed that every time I would purchase a ticket and board a flight, I would receive boarding passes with 4 S's on them. Every time I travel, every time my children travel, every time my wife travels. Every time my 86-year-old mother travels. They're all on the watch list. So, you know, it's an inconvenience, but it's insulting.
And so when you want to close down an open society, you keep everyone under surveillance so that people increasingly become too frightened to stand up and speak.
To one of these meetings came a young FBI agent, bringing with him, concealed among groceries, a portable radio transmitter.
The ties of blood that bind us to the German fatherland can never be broken.
The fifth thing that always happens in a closing society is that there's increased infiltration of citizens groups, and this is against the law. The ACLU has many documented cases of illegal infiltration of groups just like this, and in fact, there's probably someone here today. Hello! You know, I hope your audio is working well.
In 2004, at the Republican National Convention, the New York police spied illegally on anti-war protesters. There were also reports that the FBI was illegally spying on other nonviolent groups of Americans, meeting in churches and in Quaker houses of worship.
State police documents obtained by the ACLU reveal that undercover cops infiltrated local groups opposed to the death penalty and the war.
The internal documents show that nearly 36 times, undercover state police officers covertly took part in protests, like this one in November of 2005.
Sports writer David Zirin was part of a group that successfully pushed for a moratorium on the death penalty in the state of Maryland. What he didn't know was that the state police had sent undercover agents to monitor this group of American citizens' legal activities.
In the meetings was somebody who was known to us as Lucy. And Lucy would sit there. She was, the word that keeps coming to mind was peppy. Like she would sit there with a big smile on her face and ask lots of questions and take notes. It was always the most basic questions like, wow, why are we doing this? Why about, like the kind of questions that you're happy that somebody who's new to a group asks.
And he found out later that it was Lucy who was the spy.
It's obvious that they made the conclusion that nothing illegal was going on here, and yet they continued to monitor our email list. They continued to come to our meetings. That's the thing that's so upsetting about this, is that this idea that some people deserve to be watched and some people don't. People should ask that question about, well, where is my Homeland Security money going? Is it actually being used to keep us safer, or is it being used to stifle dissent?
We know that when you go to your anti-war group or your environmental group, there may well be someone there, and this is right out of COINTELPRO. We did this in the 60s and 70s until there were laws against it. Congress took action. Those have been undone. But in your local group, there's going to be some really, think about that really troublesome person who's always trying to start a fight. You know, this is a tactic to send agents in who look and dress like ordinary citizens, activists, but who are there to cause trouble, to make it difficult to move forward, to break up the group, to smear people.
Surveillance and infiltration, it's the way the state messes with people's minds to make them psychologically unwilling to stand up for themselves or even trust their own reality. It's a psychological pressure point and not just a tactical one.
The Bush administration says a president's warfighting powers include authority to detain enemy combatants, even when they're U.S. citizens.
The next thing is to arbitrarily detain and release citizens. And again, this is an intimidation tactic. Pinochet did it, the National Socialists did it. Do you guys remember James Yee?
Chaplain James Yee, a U.S. citizen, was assigned to Guantanamo Bay. He dared to speak up against the mistreatment he saw there of the prisoners.
I raised concerns about the abuses that were occurring, how specifically religion was being used as a weapon to try and break these individuals.
And then a troubling incident occurred.
Captain James Yee was arrested after he was caught with classified documents and diagrams.
Chaplain James Yee was returning from service in Guantanamo. As he got off the plane in Florida, he was detained.
Much of what they were looking at were articles that I had printed off the internet. I had been enrolled in a master's degree program, and I was doing a research paper on the Syrian president. Most immediately thereafter, I was then accused of being a terrorist spy and thrown in prison. I was locked away in a single solitary cell in Charleston, South Carolina, the very same facility where the U.S. government holds what they term U.S. citizen enemy combatants. I was worried that I was going to be falsely convicted of these heinous crimes and then wrongfully put to death, whether by the electric chair or some other means.
James Yee was held in solitary confinement for 76 days.
But now this guy is out of prison, and every time he crosses a border, they take him and hold him and release him.
My life would be forever affected by the constant surveillance that the American government puts on its U.S. citizens.
Maher Arar, software engineer.
Maher Arar, a Canadian citizen, had been vacationing with his family in Tunisia. As they were flying home, he was taken at the airport and separated from them.
I was pulled aside by immigration officials. They took my fingerprints, my photos. All of a sudden, FBI officials came and started interrogating me.
He was stopped at JFK, pulled out of line, interrogated all day, and then taken to the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York.
This father of two was held in solitary confinement for 2 weeks.
He repeatedly asks for his attorney. He tells them he'll be tortured in Syria. He tells them he doesn't want to go to Syria.
He was then taken via Jordan to Syria,
where he is detained for a year.
There was no light in there. It was 3 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and 7 feet high. It was a torture chamber.
He was whipped with an electrical cable. He was interrogated for up to 18 hours a day.
First time they beat me, I was in the chair. He showed me the cable, and he started beating me all over my body.